Douglas, in your column for the magazine this week, you talk about the issue that is probably causing the most tension and disruption between Donald Trump and his most fervent supporters. It's not the impact of the tariffs, it's not even foreign policy, really. It's the Jeffrey Epstein files. Do tell us more.
Yes, well, as you mentioned, Kate, as I write about in my column, I mean, the president is obviously pretty irritated at the moment because whenever he's asked about the Epstein case, or has been in recent days, he sort of says, well, why aren't we talking about trade? Why aren't we talking about all the successes in the country? And so on. And so he really clearly doesn't want the agenda to be dominated by a man who died 6 years ago now. But it does keep coming back, and I think it will keep coming back because everything around the Epstein affair just sort of bubbles away. There's an enormous amount that we, the public, still do not know. There have been, over the years, the decades, as you know, and people watching will know, many prominent people who've been tied up with Jeffrey Epstein. And of course, Donald Trump said on the campaign trail for re-election that he would look into releasing all the remaining files, information, and so on about Epstein. Not much more than a month after his return to office, the White House held a sort of rather strange jamboree, it has to be said, where some conservative influencers and others were handed what was called the Epstein Files, Volume 1, and sort of left the White House waving them like they'd got the golden tickets to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Only then to discover that everything that was in this Volume 1 was already publicly available. But of course it meant that people said, well, where's Volume 2, 3, whatever else? Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, helped sort of fuel that by saying that she had the Epstein client list on her desk, ready to go, only to then, in recent weeks, reverse on that and say, as others in the administration have, that there is no such thing as the client list. And currently, the administration has this problem, which is that the story around Epstein and what we don't know, and some of the more lurid conspiracy theories about it, and just theories. I mean, we shouldn't tarnish everything by saying it's conspiracy theory. Some of the more lurid theories around it have been fueled by people who are now in the administration, people at the FBI, CIA, Trump appointees, as well as the Attorney General and perhaps Trump himself. And so to now say, there's just nothing to see here, obviously hasn't in any way convinced the people who members of this administration were previously speaking to.
The president shared on Truth Social last night, we had the greatest 6 months of any president in the history of our country. And all the fake news wants to talk about is the Jeffrey Epstein hoax. I'm always baffled by where he places capital letters, but he is also baffled by why there is so much attention and emphasis on these files when, as you say, Douglas, he wants to be talking about just about anything else that he's doing in the administration at the moment. But part of the difficulty is that it's something that he said he would do, release these files. It was part of the campaign promise. He's been making good, for better or worse, on other parts of what he promised on the campaign trail. So it sticks out that he's not making good on this one. And of course, as you say, people around him, but Donald Trump himself hyped up this issue. His base, understandably, may be confused as to why they have decided it is no longer an issue, with essentially little to no explanation.
That's right. I mean, saying that he would, look into releasing the information about Jeffrey Epstein was a sort of relatively easy thing to say on the campaign trail. But of course, but he also said that he would release the remaining files about the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, and the Martin Luther King assassination. And he's done a lot of that. There was a huge dump of what seemed to be all the remaining files, of government files relating to the JFK assassination. It was released a couple of months into the administration. I wrote about that in the Spectator at the time, if you remember, and said, that one of the interesting things about this was that, and this is, of course, about a historic case, which doesn't have any of the it certainly doesn't have the same potency as the Epstein case. But the historic case of the JFK files, Trump had said, and others had said, this is going to be huge. And actually, there was nothing in the files so far, as historians have been able to find so far, that really changes in any significant way the story that Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president and was acting alone. There were some operational details about the CIA tracking Lee Harvey Oswald's movements and so on that hadn't been released before. But otherwise, there was effectively nothing new. So expectations have been raised and then slightly dashed, I suppose. But that's on a historic case. The thing with the Epstein thing that's so lethal is that there are so many people in significant positions in American public life and indeed internationally who were involved with Jeffrey Epstein. And the thing is, as I say in the column this week, is that there are lots of very tricky corners here. There is the undoubted fact that Jeffrey Epstein was convicted for, among other things, sex with underage girls, trafficking, and so on. And then there are several sort of categories, as it were, that you could put people into, which is, who was he effectively working as some kind of high-end pimp for? Which is the expectation of what the so-called client list would be if it exists. And again, there's been some dispute about that. Secondly, who was involved, like Epstein, in sex with minors. And then third, and this is where it's sort of maybe it's the sort of hardest corner, is that who are the people who Epstein simply, in his extraordinary networking habits, whatever drove them, who were the people simply who came into the orbit of Epstein and never did anything that was illegal or improper? And Trump has said in recent days that that he wanted to be careful that the people in the third group, for people who have just had, for instance, been at a party with Jeffrey Epstein or had his hospitality without any, accusations of illegal behavior or anything like that. Trump said he wanted to make sure that people who are innocent didn't just have their reputations completely, shattered by being named or identified in a massive sort of data dump of everything that's known about Epstein. And that's of course that is a reasonable and responsible attitude to take about it. But the fact that all these years later, so little has been made publicly been made publicly known about those first two categories of people involved with either sex with people who are of legal age but may have been trafficked, and those who are underage. The fact that so little of that has come out after all of these years, I think understandably does bewilder a lot of members of the public. And of course, the problem of this stage is that if you just try to pass over the whole thing, I think people aren't going to be persuaded by that. And certainly the part of the Trump base and others who have really been fed a lot of speculation as fact are going to be disappointed. But in a way, as I mentioned in the column also, all of this does feed into some very deep feelings of the public. I mean, there's the understandable outrage at the idea that anyone in public life would have been involved in sex with minors. And then there's this sort of thing of, and I mentioned the column, of course, we in Britain, not much over a decade ago, underwent a totally fictitious scandal like this or related to this, when a fantasist claimed that there had been a paedophile sex ring in Westminster. And those of us who followed that story and wrote about it at the time, you could tell it just didn't pass any smell tests. The idea that politicians in Westminster and leaders of the army and so on, often who hated each other, had disagreed on everything but sort of secretly raped and murdered children in private, didn't seem particularly believable. But it was interesting how much that caught on when irresponsible actors like Labour's Tom Watson decided to push this and run with this, what turned out to be a completely wild conspiracy theory. The Epstein thing is different from that, because there's the long catalogue of his own states' legal actions against him. So it's not like the Epstein thing is a conspiracy theory, but there are certainly conspiracies now around it, and some of which I think, as I mentioned in the piece, people have really got ahead of their skis on some of this. I mean, there are prominent commentators in the US who are saying that, as a matter of fact, they know that Epstein was some kind of intelligence asset for foreign governments, intelligence agency, or others. And, were that to be the case, it should come out. But at the moment, a lot of people are asserting that that's the case, actually without any evidence to say it is, other than just speculation. So the challenge for the administration is, how do you satisfy the expectations of people with reasonable concerns that we don't know things we should know about Epstein, and at the same time not fall into releasing a massive amount of information that could wreck the lives of completely innocent people?